The blood was royal. The welcome wasn't. October 29th, 1753. Liège, a small ecclesiastical state wedged between France and the Austrian Netherlands, belonging to no one in particular and not quite any major power's responsibility. A woman named Clementina Walkinshaw gave birth to a girl in a city chosen, almost certainly, because it was inconspicuous. Outside France, where Charles Edward Stuart was politically active, outside Papal Italy, where his family's nominal court in exile resided. A liminal space for a liminal child. The baby was baptized the same day at the Church of Sainte-Marie-des-Fonts and was named Charlotte. Her father was Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, the prince who had led a Highland army from Inverness to within 127 miles of London just 8 years earlier. The man who had briefly made the Hanoverian crown look genuinely vulnerable before losing his army at Culloden on April 16, 1746. He was the Jacobite cause in human form, the divine right claimant to the thrones of England, Scotland, and Ireland, heir to a dynasty that had been fighting for those crowns since William of Orange sailed into Torbay in 1688. He wasn't in Liège on October 29, 1753. He wouldn't acknowledge this child existed for 30 years. That decision wasn't cruelty in the conventional sense. It was political logic so airtight it swallowed a human being whole. The Jacobite cause rested on one idea above all others, that Parliament had no right to remove James II in 1688 because kings received their authority directly from God through unbroken legitimate hereditary succession, not from elected assemblies, not from popular preference, not from anything so contingent as human opinion. The theological core held that the king virtually stood above all law and reigned by virtue of divine right. The entire philosophical architecture of the movement was built on the word legitimate. A royal bastard, under English and canon law of the period, had no right of succession. That was the blunt legal reality. But the political damage went deeper than succession law. Charlotte's existence was proof that the man making the divine right argument wasn't himself living within the moral order he claimed God had ordained for kings. You can't construct a theology of sacred bloodlines and simultaneously produce children outside of marriage without handing your enemies a very effective weapon. Charles II of England, a Stuart, had acknowledged numerous illegitimate children, including the Duke of Monmouth. But Charles II was a reigning monarch. He didn't need to prove he deserved a crown because he was wearing one. Charles Edward Stuart was a claimant. His entire argument rested on the proposition that legitimacy was everything. Charlotte was the walking proof that he didn't believe his own argument, and contemporaries knew it. One account of the period argued that the Walkinshaw affair had done more damage to the Jacobite cause than any battlefield defeat. Charlotte, before she could walk, was a political catastrophe. Historical records suggest Charlotte may have had an older brother who died in infancy, erased from the record even more thoroughly than she was. Charlotte is the only child confirmed to have survived. To understand what Charlotte's life actually looked like, and the specific shape of the trap she spent it inside, you need to understand her mother first. Clementina Walkinshaw was the youngest of 10 daughters born to John Walkinshaw of Barrowfield, a Glasgow Jacobite of exceptional credentials. Her father had participated in the 1715 uprising, been captured at the Battle of Sheriff Muir, escaped from Stirling Castle, and received a royal pardon in 1717. The full arc of Jacobite commitment, with the narrow escape at the end. Clementina was probably named after James III/VIII's wife, Clementina Sobieski, and may well have been her goddaughter. She was, in short, as thoroughly Jacobite as a person could be without being born Stuart. She first met Charles in December 1745, at the height of his campaign. He fell ill with a cold and fever and took shelter at Bannockburn House, the estate of her uncle, Sir Hugh Patterson. Clementina was among those assigned to nurse him. 6 years later, in November 1752, She joined him in Ghent as his mistress. They lived together for approximately 8 years, presenting themselves as Count and Countess under aliases. The real names were too politically exposed, and also, by that point, a little difficult to explain. Almost immediately, Jacobite supporters urged Charles to break with her, convinced she was a British intelligence asset, passing information through her sister Catherine, who worked in the household of the Princess of Wales. Catherine had severed all contact with Clementina once the liaison became known, which the Jacobites read as suspicious, and which more plausibly reflects a court-employed woman wanting no professional association with her sister's choices. Sir Walter Scott later dramatized the suspicion in Red Gauntlet. Frank McLean's scholarship concluded, definitively, that the accusation was false. Clementina Walkinshaw wasn't a Hanoverian spy. She was a Jacobite woman who had made a consequential romantic decision and was being blamed for the slow disintegration of a cause that had other, considerably larger problems. What life with Charles actually looked like during those 8 years is well documented and flatly incompatible with the Romantic legend. By the early 1750s, he was already deeply dependent on alcohol. Not a heavy social drinker, but a man whose attachment to drinking had become the organizing principle of his days. He was paranoid and increasingly convinced that his own supporters were betraying him. He was violent. A contemporary observer, Dr. King, recorded that the couple both contracted an odious habit of drinking and often quarreled, and sometimes fought. The scholarly assessment in The Last Jacobites, a serious examination of the post-Culloden period, describes Charles without hedging as a wife-beating alcoholic. The dashingly handsome prince of 1745, the one the French court had feted and the Scottish Highlands had wept for, had been replaced within a decade by a bitter, paranoid, violent man who had never psychologically recovered from the destruction of everything he'd been promised. Charlotte was born into that household in October 1753. She spent her first 6 years inside it. In July 1760, Clementina left. She took Charlotte, 6 years old, turning 7 that October, and walked out. The documented reason was physical abuse. Charles, reportedly furious, responded by refusing to pay a single coin toward the support of either of them. The Stuart family's management of this moment established the pattern that would govern the next 3 decades with near-perfect consistency. James III/VIII, Charles's father, the exiled king in Rome, quietly continued to provide a pension to Clementina and Charlotte until his death on January 1, 1766. His son wanted nothing to do with them. His father funded them through the back channels of exile court finance. The Stuart hierarchy was already doing what it would do for the next quarter-century, acknowledging Charlotte's existence just enough to keep her alive, never enough to admit she existed in public. Support without recognition, money without a name. By 1767, the family had taken the additional step of making sure the legal record was unambiguous. Clementina signed an affidavit on March 9th of that year, confirming that there had never been a marriage between her and Charles. Whatever sympathetic ambiguity a reader might have tried to construct, perhaps there had been a secret ceremony, perhaps documentation would yet emerge, was formally closed off. Charlotte was illegitimate under both canon and civil law, and there was now a signed document to that effect, authored by her own mother. When James III/VIII died in 1766, the pension passed to Cardinal Henry Benedict Stuart. Charlotte's uncle, a prince of the church, the last male Stuart, continued the stipend at a reduced rate. He knew Charlotte existed. He had a theological and institutional framework that made it convenient to leave her in exactly that position. Known, barely provided for, never acknowledged. Charlotte spent the years between 1760 and 1784 living in French convents on a small pension, in conditions her biographers describe as near poverty. The convent arrangement was en pension. She was a resident, not a religious, the 18th century equivalent of being permanently housed in an institution as a paying guest, dependent on the goodwill of those running it and the continued willingness of her uncle to send money. She had no recognized name. No court in Europe was required to call her anything in particular. She couldn't marry without her father's acknowledgement, and her father wasn't acknowledging her. Too well born for ordinary life, too illegitimate for the world she'd been born into, suspended in between, with no mechanism for escape. So, she wrote letters. The Stuart papers, the correspondence archive of the exiled Jacobite court, now held at Windsor Castle, contain Charlotte's letters to both Charles and Henry Benedict. Historians who have accessed the archive confirm what she was repeatedly requesting: recognition as Charles's daughter, financial support sufficient for a dignified life, and permission to marry. The same requests, across many letters, across many years. Charles broke off all contact despite the continued letters and pleas from Charlotte. Henry Benedict's own papers describe her correspondence as containing curious but now unverifiable claims, a scholar's formulation for letters that were, even to later readers with no personal stake in suppressing them, difficult to fully assess. By 1774, Charlotte had tried a different channel entirely. A document called The Memoir of Charlotte Stuart was filed with the French Foreign Office that year. She was 21 years old. She had taken her case to a foreign government's diplomatic machinery, asking the French state to acknowledge what her own father wouldn't. When family correspondence failed, she tried statecraft. Charles ignored that too. He had other hopes. The Jacobite court in exile had spent the post-Culloden decades in a long, slow contraction. When James III/VIII died in 1766, Pope Clement XIII, the reigning pontiff, refused to acknowledge Charles as the new Jacobite king. It was the Vatican's way of announcing that the cause was no longer its concern, and no subsequent pope reversed the decision. The court persisted as a structural fiction because it had internal momentum. While Charles lived, there was a claimant, and while there was a claimant, there was notionally a cause. Charlotte's invisibility was load-bearing in that structure. Acknowledging her meant acknowledging the line continued only through a bastard, which was the same as admitting the cause was already over. In 1772, Charles made his last serious attempt at dynastic survival. He married Princess Louise Maximiliane of Stolberg-Gedern, born September 20th, 1752, making her 20 years old to his 51. They settled in Florence under the familiar Stuart fiction of Count and Countess of Albany. Louise was intelligent, well-read, and eventually became a significant figure in European intellectual life, forming a deep friendship and, in time, a recognized partnership with the Italian playwright Vittorio Alfieri. What she encountered in Florence wasn't the romantic pretender she may have imagined, but a man in serious decline. Drinking heavily, paranoid, volatile, and unable to produce the legitimate heir the cause needed. In November 1780, he attacked her. She left. The papal divorce was granted in 1784. The marriage produced no children. 8 years of matrimony, the Jacobite cause's last viable bet, had ended in an assault in a Florentine apartment. Charlotte was 30 years old when the papal divorce was confirmed. She had been in convents for 24 years. Nobody asked her anything. On March 23, 1783, Charles altered his will to name Charlotte his heir. 7 days later, on March 30th, he signed an act of legitimation. On March 30th, 1784, He formally created her Duchess of Albany in the Jacobite peerage, granting her the Scottish title and signing an act allowing her to inherit his French properties. The document was submitted to Louis XVI of France for confirmation. Several things need to be understood clearly about this sequence. The act was contested before the ink was dry. Cardinal Henry Benedict Stuart, Charlotte's uncle, the man who had been quietly reducing her pension for nearly 20 years, filed a formal written protest. A document titled, "Protest Against the Legitimation of Charlotte, Duchess of Albany, 1784, exists in the historical record. Charlotte's own uncle, in writing, fought her recognition. His motivations were both ideological and practical. Legitimizing a bastard violated the central argument the cause had built itself on for a century, and recognizing Charlotte complicated the succession order he expected to inherit as the last male Stuart. It fell to a foreign king to overrule him. Louis XVI confirmed the act. That sounds like a victory. It was narrower than it sounds. What Louis confirmed was a property matter, the legal mechanism allowing Charlotte to inherit French assets. The French court didn't suddenly begin treating Charlotte as a princess of royal blood. No European monarch did. The Pope in 1784 was Pius VI, who had reigned since 1775, and his approach to Stuart affairs was continuous with his predecessors. Quiet, non-engagement. Clement XIII had declined to recognize Charles as king in 1766. Charlotte's entire status derived from Charles's status. Pius VI didn't need to issue a specific refusal for Charlotte. The framework was already in place. Her title was a gift from a man whose own kingship Rome had declined to acknowledge for nearly 2 decades. Within his Florentine household, Charles required everyone to address Charlotte as Duchesse d'Albany. A contemporary observer recorded the insistence as a rule of the house, something enforced in the immediate circle, something Charles apparently needed to hear said aloud. Outside that house, the rest of Europe consistently used Lady Charlotte Stuart. The title was real within the room. It evaporated at the threshold. In July 1784, he summoned her to Florence. She left the convent. She left France. She also left something, someone, in fact, that fundamentally reframes her years in Florence and the story of the dynasty itself. Charlotte had 3 children. Their father was Prince Ferdinand de Rohan-Guéméné, Ferdinand de Rohan, Archbishop of Bordeaux, later Archbishop of Cambrai. The de Rohan family was one of the most powerful noble houses in France, producing cardinals, archbishops, and princes across multiple generations. Ferdinand held one of the most senior ecclesiastical positions in the country. He was also, by the nature of his office, a man who could never marry. The only man who would be with Charlotte was one who, structurally, could never legitimize what they had together. Charlotte had 3 children with him, a son she named Charles Edward Stuart, later known as the Count de Hohenstadt, and 2 daughters, Victoire Adelaide and Charlotte Maximilienne Amélie. None of them were publicly acknowledged. All 3 were left with Clementina Walkinshaw, their grandmother, to be raised in anonymity in France, while Charlotte traveled to Italy to attend to the man who had spent 30 years declining to attend to her. The timing repays careful attention. The Count de Hohenstadt was born on May 13, 1784. Charlotte received the summons to Florence in July 1784, 8 weeks later. She had just delivered a child by a French archbishop in secret, and within 2 months was traveling to Italy, handing her infant son to her own mother in France. The dynasty required her presence. She was available because the dynastic arithmetic had spent 30 years ensuring she would be. No publicly acknowledged family, no recognized obligations, useful precisely because she had been arranged to be available. Clementina, meanwhile, was deteriorating. Contemporary sources describe her as having declined into severe religious intensity during these years, a condition her own mother had suffered before her. The woman who had fled Charles's abuse with a 6-year-old daughter in 1760 was now raising 3 secret royal grandchildren in anonymity, her mental health failing, her situation as invisible to the world as Charlotte's had always been. The Stuart dynasty's talent for disappearing its own people had extended through 3 generations of the same family line. Charlotte lived in Florence from July 1784 until Charles's death, 3.5 years. She managed his household, nursed him through his physical deterioration, and stayed. Charles required the title to be used. He required it of everyone in his immediate circle. This small group of people who had agreed, explicitly or by proximity, to maintain the fiction that any of it still meant something. Scholars studying Stuart portraiture have noted that Charlotte bore a striking physical resemblance to her father. The same features, visible in both of them. The family likeness was there all along. The legal acknowledgement had taken 30 years to arrive. Charles Edward Stuart died on January 31st, 1788. The accounts that survive record that he was mourned only by Charlotte. The daughter his life had treated so badly was the only person who stayed to the end. After his death, Charlotte moved from Florence to Bologna. She was 34 years old. She had left her children in France, nursed her father through 3 years of dying, and emerged with a title no European court had honored, no recognized legal standing, and no obvious place in any institutional hierarchy. Clementina was still in France with the 3 children. In November 1788, Charlotte was diagnosed with liver cancer. She was 35. Cardinal Henry Benedict Stuart inherited the empty Jacobite claim as titular Henry IX. He was 62 years old. He had formally contested Charlotte's legitimization just 4 years earlier. He would outlive Charlotte, and Charles, and the cause, and most of the people who had ever cared about any of it, dying in 1807 as the last Stuart claimant. His final years offer their own quiet commentary. By 1800, he had passed his papers, the Stuart Correspondence Archive, accumulated across decades of exile, to George III, the Hanoverian king, and received a British government pension in exchange. He died at peace with the dynasty his family had spent a century trying to displace. The Stuart Papers, the entire documentary record of the exiled court, Charlotte's unanswered letters included, are now at Windsor Castle. The Jacobite cause's archives are a Hanoverian possession. The direct line ended in 1807 with the death of Henry, Cardinal York. That is how historians phrase it. The more precise statement is this: the direct line from Charles Edward Stuart ended in Bologna on November 17, 1789. Charlotte Stuart, Duchess of Albany, died on November 17, 1789. She was 36 years old. 22 months had passed since her father's death. Her 3 children were still in France, still unacknowledged, still hidden. She didn't publicly recognize them before she died. Her will exists, a document drawn up by a dying 36-year-old woman with royal blood, a ducal title that no European court had honored, and 3 children whose names she couldn't safely put in writing. But it didn't break the silence. The same arithmetic that had erased her offered no clean exit. Naming them would have confirmed her own bastardry all over again. A woman legitimized by a piece of paper in a French foreign ministry, acknowledging children who would have the exact same status she'd had for 30 years. The system had no path that didn't circle back to the same wall. Charlotte's son, the Count de Rohenstart, grew up largely in his grandmother Clementina's care. The last traceable direct descendant of Charles Edward Stuart died unrecognized, carrying blood that officially didn't count. Here is what this story actually reveals about the dynasty, not just the woman. The Stuarts built their entire political identity on the argument that bloodlines were sacred, that sovereignty flowed through legitimate hereditary descent by divine arrangement, not by parliamentary vote, not by anything so fragile as popular opinion. They lost 3 kingdoms defending that argument. Charles Edward Stuart spent 4 decades in European exile maintaining a shadow court, pressing a claim to crowns he would never hold, writing himself as a king in the margins of a world that had moved on. The argument required him to be a certain kind of man, living within the proper order of God-ordained family life, embodying the principles he was asking Europe to restore him to power for. He produced Charlotte instead. Then he spent 30 years pretending he hadn't, because Charlotte was the most efficient proof possible that the man making the divine right argument wasn't, in his private life, living by it. Acknowledging her would have meant acknowledging that the cause's central premise, that God's ordained order flowed through legitimate blood, was something Charles himself had violated in an apartment in Ghent. The act of legitimation in 1784 is sometimes framed as a redemption story. The evidence doesn't support that framing. His legitimate marriage had collapsed after he attacked his wife. He had no remaining hope of a legitimate heir. He needed someone to put in his will, someone to nurse him, someone to be present at the end. Charlotte was the only option. He signed the act, required the title to be used in the room, and summoned her to be useful. When he died, she was the only one who stayed. That is the relationship described in full: 30 years of erasure, 4 years of conditional use, and Charlotte at the bedside. What makes Charlotte's story structurally devastating, rather than just personally terrible, is what it reveals about the system she was born inside. The obsession with legitimate bloodlines didn't protect Charlotte. It created the conditions in which she had to be hidden. And then it created the conditions in which her children had to be hidden, because Charlotte, legitimized at 30, conducting a long-term relationship with an archbishop who could never marry her, with no institutional standing from which to publicly acknowledge illegitimate children, had inherited the system along with the title. She wasn't cruel to her children. She was shaped by the same logic that had shaped her from birth. 3 more people with direct Stuart blood grew up unrecognized in French anonymity, raised by a deteriorating grandmother, because the dynasty's mathematics had no room for anything that was actually alive. The dynasty that defined itself by the sanctity of bloodlines managed to lose track of its own blood entirely. The Stuart papers are in Windsor. The cause is in history books. The people, Charlotte, her children, her mother declining in a French convent, are mostly footnotes. Charlotte Stuart was born on October 29, 1753, baptized the same day in a church in a city that belonged to no one, by a father who spent 30 years pretending she didn't belong to him either. She died on November 17, 1789, in Bologna, at 36, with 3 children she couldn't name, a title nobody outside one room had honored, and the distinction of being the last direct descendant of a dynasty that was too committed to its own theory of bloodlines to acknowledge the blood it actually had. The blood was royal. It always was. The welcome, for Charlotte, and for the 3 children she left behind in France, never came. Subscribe for more stories like this.